Okay, cool. And now we're online and just waiting, I guess.
Hi guys.
Oh,
Is the mic fine?
yep. Mia, are you Plague or Sith?
This is I'm Sith,
Okay.
but I'm not sure how I should refer to myself because I have some other nicknames online, and I'm not sure. But you can just call me Micha. Micha, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, will do. Okay. I think we're just waiting on Plague now, and that'll be the thing. And then we can get started on subjectivity.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Yep.
M-I-H-A.
There we go.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we're just waiting on one more person, and then we'll start.
He's got to download Chrome.
Yeah. I originally had Veronica slated to come on, but she ran into technical difficulties, so she couldn't make it. And I was like, there was no way I could reschedule this.
Yeah.
Because we've got Precarious Japan sometime in the future. And then we've got what's it called? And then we've got I still have to do anime fan communities with Sandra and Annette sometime next month before I go to Anime Expo. So it's just like a series of things. Whose background noise is that?
Don't believe it's me.
Maybe mine's muted. Not sure.
Okay. Yeah, there's just so much stuff. It's going to be exciting. I think this is going to be fun.
All right.
We just gotta wait for Blake to download and install Chrome so we can talk about the subjectivity penises, vomit,
and our dad's symbolic penis.
Hell yeah. Talk about panopticons. Talk about schizoanalysis. It's going to be great. It's going to be fun. I think this is sort of it's an actual penis. God damn it, Isaac. My colleague is he's in this live chat right now. And he's just shit posting.
Hey, is that Blake in here?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yo, Blake. How's it going?
Hello.
Yo. All right. Isaac, you got to fix your mic, man, so you can join and talk about Kristeva, dog. Well, Freud is... So I don't think it's worthwhile to necessarily discredit Freud yet, because Freud is kind of essential to understanding a lot of things that come after Freud. You don't have to... What happened to Mia? Oh, so Jode, you don't have to subscribe to Freud to read or try to understand Freud, because there are some things that are pretty useful. Okay, are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Am I still audible?
Yeah, sure.
I can still hear you.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's see. Okay, so let's sort of get this started here. So this is sort of more of a really off the cuff discussion. I don't really know if this is really going to become anything sort of like on the podcast, really, but we'll see. We'll see how well the audio turns out for the live hangout session. But this is I guess you can call it sort of like a 7.5 episode. I don't know. It's sort of in between, because I don't really know where else to put this, but this is Nick Mansfield's Subjectivity. And I chose this particular book because I think it's a very useful survey of understanding a lot of very prominent theorists in terms of how they approach what the subject is and what subjectivity necessarily means. And I think this is actually very useful and very applicable when we're talking about it in the context of, media theory, analysis, when we're talking about in terms of, anime analysis, because one of the things that comes up all the time when people are talking about their material that they make is, well, these are subjective analyses. These are, I'm taking a subjective viewpoint. Well, what does that necessarily mean? And so I think this book is a very useful one, because in some ways it does prime us with the tools we need to sort of figure out how and what lens are we going at these particular texts, and how we can figure out what's going on. And if anybody is interested, this may help fill up a little bit of the gaps that might arise when people are watching my videos, because it's very obvious that I like a lot of these theories.
Yeah, definitely. Like, you can tell how you've taken at least a little bit of this book for your own content.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
I can understand where you're coming from better.
Yeah.
I saw some of your references on Lacan, I think, in one of your previous videos. So I think, pretty visible.
Yeah. So, oh yeah, I mean the Ava video was entirely about Lacan. The entire idea of, I mean, like if you're looking at someone like Azuma Hiroki, who's talked a little bit about Seikaike texts, I mean, he argues that Seikaike are essentially Lacanian. They're Lacanian apocalyptic stories, roughly speaking. And so, well, that ends up bringing up the question, like, well, what does that necessarily mean? What does Lacanian apocalypse necessarily mean? And so understanding Lacan gives us a way to understand, in part, what Seikaike is supposed to mean. So it's, it's all those little things I think might be really useful. And, even if people don't watch my content, later on when they're, watching shows themselves or applying material themselves, it can be very useful as well. So let's sort of get into this. So I don't have the usual guests with me. I have first of all, I have De Monte Cristo,
Hey,
or I
how's
don't
it
know how
going?
you. I have Mia,
Hi.
and I have. Do you want me to call you Plague or?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
All right, so let's just stick to the usual format that we do when we're doing this book club, which is let's sort of go around and sort of get rough thoughts on what you think of the book so far.
All right. So I guess I'll just jump in. This was really cool. I've always wanted to know this kind of stuff, but their material always just seems so inaccessible to me. So it's really cool that Mansfield kind of wrote this rough primer, this kind of crash course in 20th century continental philosophy and cultural theory. Yeah, if you want to know what postmodernism is, I guess this is the go-to, because I feel a little more comfortable using that term now, because I feel like that word's just kind of thrown around like this buzzword that's either a pejorative or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel this is pretty good as not so much as an introduction, but maybe more like a guide. That I wouldn't go into this just taking what's here. I think if someone wanted to get into all of these topics, it might be good to read this alongside all of the writers that are mentioned, because well, at least with the writers that I know, I felt that it definitely was missing some important elements of them, which I guess we can get into that later. And for authors that I'm not familiar with, I never really felt I quite got it. Like with Hegel, I still don't know. I've never read him, so I was a bit confused on those bits. So I think it's better as a guide than an introduction.
I have a rough idea of the Hegel that Mansfield is going for, so I think we can collectively try and close in the gaps, because that might be useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think it's a pretty good introduction, especially since like I read stuff like Azuma Hiroki, and he throws out all these terms, and maybe right now I feel a little less like a hack just for knowing these terms. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Azuma Hiroki specifically Azuma Hiroki, it's very useful to know theory with Hiroki, because he oftentimes likes to use theorists in terms without directly explaining what he means by them. I believe Otaku Japan's Database Animals, there was one particular paragraph that really stood out to me where he used Zizek, Lacan, and Koheve all together in one paragraph, and I thought to myself, oh my god,
Yeah.
If nobody knows what he's going for here, it's just going to sound like nonsense.
Yeah. So I probably have to reread that.
I think the book, nevertheless, I think Otaku Japan's Database Animals is pretty straightforward, nevertheless, without these theories. But I think it's sort of useful to understand the lineage that he's trying to draw from. And I've mentioned this before, but I mean, like, part of the reason why a lot of these theorists are useful is because a lot of, I don't know if I'd call them media theorists, they wouldn't call themselves media theorists, but a lot of the people that we think about coming out of Japan that are talking about anime, manga, otaku, and so on and so forth, a lot of them are, partly influenced by the works of Asura Akira and his very famous book, Structure and Force, which itself drew very heavily upon continental philosophy and continental theory. And so I think it's important to understand where this lineage partly comes from. And when you're taking a look at, say, for instance, the work on something like lolicon, or when you're looking at the work, if you're looking at, say, how Japanese theorists look at something like moe, I mean, that itself comes from the works of people like Otsuka Eiji, and particularly later on, that comes from Saito Tamaki and his work, Beautiful Fighting Girl, which is a Lacanian exercise of sexuality, partly. And so I think it's really useful to understand, well, what do these people mean? Because now we have all of this sort of soup of things. So I think it is useful in a lot of ways. I think this is a very useful book. So do you guys want to cover sort of the general big stuff before we get into individual chapters, or were there any particular questions or concerns you guys had?
Without going too deep into individual stuff, I guess one difficulty I had reading this book was I was never sure if I was actually disagreeing with something Mansfield was elaborating, or if I just didn't understand it properly because of the sort of brevity with which he was forced to present some of these ideas. What I think is interesting about this book is he presents this general argument between psychoanalytic and post-structural approaches, and there was something about the way he presented psychoanalysis that I really disliked, that I really disagreed with, and I wasn't really sure if I was missing out on something, or if Mansfield was presenting like actually pretty much what psychoanalysis was about. So I guess that was one thing that I had issues with. But
what did you think he was presenting about psychoanalysis?
Okay, so I guess, so we're just gonna dive in now, or should I just?
Yeah, sure, might as well.
Okay, so I guess so the chapters, the two chapters that he begins with to launch into this psychoanalysis versus post-structuralism debate are chapters 2 and 3, respectively devoted to Freud and Lacan. So to briefly treat Freud, there was something about Freud's argumentation such that it just seemed like he was making shit up as he went along, like arbitrarily singling out the sexual organs and gender politics as formative of the individual psyche, and as opposed to so many other factors that play into the formation of said gender politics that constitute the individual psyche. And then Lacan in chapter 3 just sort of like rides on this, but in this way that I just did not understand. So Lacan then riffs off of the semiology of Ferdinand de Saussure about how the psyche is formed by language, this system of signs which carry meaning with them, and which is all well and good, but then later on he's just like, yeah, this is just like your dad's penis, which I didn't really understand. I didn't get why that was phallic in any way. And then after that, you have all these feminist theorists. It's like, okay, well, if Lacan says that the system of signs, aka the symbolic order, is like a penis, then I will define this other thing as the feminine. And if you already disagree with the symbolic order being phallic, then I'm also going to disagree with this other thing that you're contrasting it with, because I disagree with what you're opposing to begin with. And so all bits of psychoanalysis let me backpedal. All approaches to gender, sexuality, and ethnicity that play off of this conversation that these theorists are having with Lacan and Freud, if you already disagree with Lacan and Freud to begin with, I felt like I had nothing to agree with these post-Freudian and post-Lacanian theorists. If that made sense.
Okay. So my understanding of sort of the division, so I'm not as well versed in Freud as I am in terms of Lacan. Lacan is really where I'm a little bit more familiar with psychoanalysis. My understanding of Jacques Lacan's use of the penis and the phallic is not to actually denote it's not to denote a biological penis. It's specifically to, one, it essentially is to call back to Freud, because, Lacan's got that whole return to Freud phase. And so he's trying to draw back to Freud. And so what I think he's trying to emphasize by drawing back to Freud was he's essentially saying, well, hold on, there are some major problems with Freud's material here, but there are some very notable things. And so Lacan is essentially saying, well, I think the idea of sort of how the subject functions with an unconscious and conscious are useful. The idea that the subject may be split into different ways is useful, but it's not about any sort of particular gender markers. And I'm using the term gender markers rather than particularly biological markers, because Freud does make the concession later on. Freud does make the concession later on that he's not talking about innately man or woman, but he's talking about man as being raised in the male Vienna household and woman as being raised in the female Vienna household. But Lacan sort of pushes a lot of that aside. And Lacan says, it's language. We're going into language, but how do we describe this language? Well, we can't just simply describe it as, you enter into just language, because just language implies that there is some sort of singular unitary essence to it. And the ramifications of that claim is that means that there is some other type of system that is analogous to language that we do not necessarily have. So he's making this partial conceit that there is some other thing out there. And that's why I think a lot of feminist psychoanalysts are Lacanian, because when you look at someone like Haraway, who goes on and says that, well, one of the big problems with Freud is that he's talking through a male language and there has to be this feminine language. It's essentially to say that it's essentially a claim on how we think, because by saying that there's a feminine language, it means that there is some other way to look at something. And it's kind of funny because, like, let's take another example from the book here. Like, you remember the chapter on Deleuze and Guattari, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rhizome, if we're going to take the analogy that Haraway is placing up, the psychoanalytic analogy of language as masculine, the masculine language might be how we consider theory as arborescent, whereas a rhizomatic structure could be considered as feminine because it is the other thing. So do you get what I'm going at here?
Right. Okay. So
yeah,
when you said that the subject does not merely enter into just language, but that there is this sort of other thing that we that we treat as like a frame of reference.
Yes. So it enters into a particular language.
Okay. I guess that went over my head. So that whole name of the father transcendental signifier business, I guess, is that the other beyond language that you're referring to?
Well, the nom du père, or the name of the father, or the symbolic, is essentially just there are some very small differences from what I see in his work in Écrit, but for the most part, they essentially just note the quote-unquote main language that a subject enters into when they are ripped from the other.
Okay, and he says that this is masculine because it's a masculine language that we assimilate to.
Yes, and not
Okay.
masculine as necessarily being like, oh, because it's driven by men or something. Like like the matriarchal, like a society run by a matriarchy can still be entering a masculine language. The masculine language, the term masculine just notes that it's the dominant language.
It's also, I believe, to denote the difference from the other, which is the motherly, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, the mother is the other. So essentially, bare bones psychoanalysis is when the baby is born. When the baby is born, the baby has no conception of the world surrounding it. It believes the world is it. And so it's where it gets to the Freudian adage that the baby is God, because it has no distinction. And then the moment where it realizes so that's why it thinks the mother is part of it. The moment it realizes that the mother is separate, that it has this conception of a self of its own self, is where we get to what Lacan calls the mirror stage. And apparently it's supposed to happen around 6 to 18 months. I don't know child psychology. I don't know.
He got that wrong. Yeah, that everything about like the actual biological stuff, he got it wrong. But I believe he corrected it towards the end of his life, or other people did, and he was like, whatever. It's just like a sense that's a conflict that starts at a certain age but happens through all of your life. So he went from like a bit more rigorous scientific idea into more of the philosophy that's now that is now understood as. Yeah.
Do you know the specific text that he says that, or like the lecture that he says?
No, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, it's been a while, but
okay, fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
But is the general, because my understanding of it is that the general conceit of the mirror stage still stands, in that there is this moment where the subject creates a line of self-definition. Like, is that still there, or has he?
Yeah, as I believe, it's a conflict that starts at a certain age, but he went from saying that it's specifically just the mirror, because that's how it started.
Like, I'm not saying. Yeah, I'm not saying it's just the mirror.
Actually, yeah, it had its roots on actually like a Gestaltian process, and then it went from that to like a bit more ambiguous process and that's how it became like a conflict that lasts all of your life.
Okay, yeah. So
I'm not sure when it happened though.
Okay, yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, like, yeah. So that's okay. That still falls in line with what I'm trying to get at, which is that there's this moment where the subject, begins to construct a sort of a line between the world and itself, and how it negotiates being it is by by entering the symbolic, which is the system that it yields or it uses to understand and behave in the world, but also that system partially uses it in particular ways. I don't know where I was going with this. What was the original thing?
Sorry.
I think we got into this because I didn't understand why the symbolic was masculine. Because, I guess that's how we got into this.
Well, I think there's a particular irony when we're talking about the symbolic being masculine. Well, I don't know if I'd say irony. There's something interesting about it, because we understand psychoanalysis partly through how Freud understands women, particularly his female subjects, through psychoanalysis. But
could I jump in with that real quick?
Yeah.
So the thing I remember that part kind of rubbing me the wrong way, and sort of like I was reading this chapter on Freud, and I was sort of anticipating, okay, well, how is everyone else going to sort of riff on this and respond to this? There's this part in the book. Let me flip to it real quick, if I can just find it. Oh, okay. There's this interesting passage on like page 34, okay, where I guess Mansfield summarizes, quote, this emphasis on the masculine as the standard produces some quite bizarre results. For example, in his 1919 paper on masochism, A Child is Being Beaten, Freud considered himself limited in having a preponderance of female case studies from which to theorize. His impulse was to develop a theory of the male masochist from this material and then develop his model of female masochism from the male. The idea of developing a female model first does not seem to have been possible for him. So off the bat, that just seems completely arbitrary to me. That why is already off the bat, Freud is like making clear he has like a male bias in how he approaches the study of the psyche, and then for Lacan to just kind of adopt this, but move away from the biology of the psyche, so to speak, and to just kind of transplant that analysis onto language and just being like, oh, okay, so Freud begins with male biology to treat the psyche, so I'm just gonna now treat language as an inherently masculine system. It just seems kind of arbitrary, particularly because in chapter 3, when it the chapter on Lacan, the sort of Mansfield talks about how Lacan is riffing off of the semiology or semiotics of Ferdinand de Saussure, how Saussure just generally gives pretty acceptable concepts, like that individuals assimilate into language, which Saussure describes as a system of signs, each of which connects a material form, the signifier, written marks in a page or spoken sounds in the mouth, with an abstract concept it's signified, right? So that seems like, that's a fairly reasonable depiction. And then Lacan just says, oh, this is a masculine system. And I didn't really understand why he would just kind of say that, if you follow what I'm saying. And I guess that's why I sort of favored the Foucauldian approach, which was, okay, well, why is the general system masculine? There's an underlying gender politics at work, which sort of frames language to be in that way, I guess. If that was coherent, or I'm probably getting all this wrong, but
no, I think
you did get it right.
Yeah,
I think it's like, I'm not sure if Lacan drew that line over that bridge, but it's the whole argument was put like Freud, the Freudian subject is mostly is a male, is a boy who just kind of when he comes to this stage in his development, he makes these contradictions, he feels ashamed, and then he forms the subconscious. And this is where I think I'm not sure if the subconscious is part of this symbolic order. So I think this is where Lacan takes over the ego part and kind of runs with the ego. I think I got it like that. I'm not sure if that's what is I was supposed to take from that, but I think that was the connection.
Yeah, I think there maybe is like a little bit of a gap by using so much people who took directly from Freud, because obviously like the side that wants a more rigorous definition of the subject has a lot of people who don't like Freud at all. And here they're all presented as being kind of on the Foucaultian side, which may give people like maybe the wrong idea.
Like I was with Lacan up until the name of the father bit, in which I didn't understand why for him the symbolic order was necessarily masculine, or that this transcendental signifier from which the ego gets its sense of self from the other was necessarily a masculine system. It just seemed like an arbitrary depiction of the symbolic order to me. But that was pretty much my only beef. And then, but I mean, after that, in the rest of the book, every other psychoanalytic theorist kind of made a reference to that, which me personally, I disagreed with that sort of framework. And so that sort of induced a bias in me, in Mansfield's, a bias against all other psychoanalytic theorists in their treatment of ethnicity, sexuality, and stuff like that. Because I already disagree with that which they're opposing. So
I think so. I'm going to try and explain it.
Did that make sense?
Yeah. I'm going to try and explain why I think that's the case. So Freud's cases were dominantly women, but he uses these situations to talk about men. And so there's a particular sort of strangeness that Lacan is sort of drawing back to when he's talking about language, because he's using Freud as this case of, well, here is how language may in part function politically, because, you know, Freud's work is essentially about how a guy is trying to construct a model about guys from cases on women, and not just women, but women from a particular culture. And not just women from a particular culture, but women from a particular class of a particular culture. And so there's all these peculiarities associated, but it always gets sold as this model that applies in some universal context. You know, the guy and the woman undergoes castration and penis envy and all that kind of stuff. And Lacan is essentially saying, well, here's a sort of trouble with that, which is that, you know, that's a very specific perspective trying to sell itself as some sort of universal language. And that's why he uses the term masculine. Because I think in that sort of return to Freud move, he's essentially referencing how Freud ended up doing his work, and partly why Lacan disagrees with him and why he ends up having to change that specific thing to be about language. If that makes sense.
So he doesn't really mean, when Lacan uses the word masculine, it's not in the sense that we normally associate with the word masculine.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, it's not necessarily about a man.
Oh,
it's
okay.
more so masculine is essentially to mean the main language.
So, okay, well, I mean, if you put it, I hate to just kind of keep being like, oh no, fuck this. It's just, if to me that just seems like a semantic move to just be like, okay, well, I don't really mean masculine as macho, I just mean masculine as dominant. And then if that's the case, then I don't really see a reason for people like Haraway to be like, oh, okay, well, if that's masculine, which doesn't really mean masculine, then I'm going to define the feminine as this, which isn't really feminine.
Well, it's Haraway is sort of a very.
I feel it was still gendered. Like it wasn't masculine in a biological sense, but it was still gendered for Lacan, because it was still tied to the idea of being born out of a woman, and that's the part that many feminists didn't like.
Yeah, I think there's a particular poignancy in sort of calling back in part of these gender markers, because you're right, Blake, or was me? I still can't differentiate your voices well enough yet.
I just made the remark about being born.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think Lacan, I think, you know, yeah, being born out of a woman, and then, you know, regardless of whether you're male or not, you sort of fall into language in a specific way. I think Lacan really doesn't have a vocabulary to really describe how that plays all together that isn't gendered.
Okay, fair,
I think that's
fair
sort
enough.
of the trouble. And I think, when we get to someone like Urgaray is trying to completely dismantle any sort of fixity the idea of a masculine language has, which is why she emphasizes the feminine language. Because I think Urgaray's big contribution is essentially saying, well, how do you imagine a feminine language? How would you imagine a feminine language? And the answer is you probably can't, because we've been so ingrained in the masculine language that understanding a feminine language is impossible. It falls into the Lacanian real. It's somewhere out there. We don't know what it is. And so trying to understand what that other language is partly important on a theoretical level. I don't know how practical it would actually be, because it sort of has that unfalsifiability to it. Because the moment you consider it, it falls into the symbolic. And so it's this constantly shifting theoretical goalpost, I feel. But I think it is still important to consider that there can be something out there that can still function. Something so innately alien to us.
Okay, fair enough. It's just I was reading when I was reading Urgaray's treatment of feminine culture. I was just I was thinking back to why not approach this in the manner Mary Wollstonecraft did in, I believe, 1790s or so, her essay A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Looking back on that, I suppose, from maybe a Lacanian perspective, I suppose, in that whole essay, she's in a masculine culture, and she's using the terms and conditions of said masculine culture against itself to call out masculine culture on its hypocrisy. And so I was reading Irigaray's treatment of the so-called feminine psyche, and it just seemed to me that she was making out the feminine to be a bunch of irrationalism, which I didn't feel was very fair to women, I suppose. Like, just her trying to be like, oh, this is how the feminine works, when you have people like Wollstonecraft who, that's not what it is at all. I don't know.
Well, I think that's sort of like the theoretical problem here. I think that's sort of the theoretical challenge that Urgaray is tackling, because we can see in that exact moment that Mansfield is describing and that you're using from Mansfield, which is that this other thing to us is irrational because it pushes up against the language we are already familiar with.
Okay, sure.
And so what Urgaray is saying, well, that other thing, because it's not part of us, is irrational. But what if we subsume ourselves into that language? Well, how do we do that? Well, we don't know, because it's sort of a trap, because we can't get out of our language to consider that one. And that's why you sort of have and I think that's really useful when we're looking at sort of like the language of like hyper radical groups, because they don't make sense to us.
Oh, that's interesting.
But to them, they function on a language. It's because they function on a sort of a system that's so different from what we would consider to be rational and logical. And so that itself is, we can say that's an example of like a sort of a quasi-feminine language,
Well, yeah, but that language of the radical is still coming out from the dominant language.
Yeah, and that's sort of my trouble in trying to understand Urgaray, which is that like, well, at what moment can we say that this is a feminine language? And I think that's a really good point you bring up, which is that it's very difficult to sort of consider what falsifiability exists in this.
Okay, I guess that makes a little more sense.
Yeah, I mean, that lack of falsifiability, that's a bit of my problem with, probably even psychoanalysis in general, at least the way the stuff that comes from Freud still. And I think the book could have used some authors who didn't come from that school of thought, because there's plenty to go around, and it kind of paints a weaker side because it does that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess to me, the quote unquote rational kernel of psychoanalysis is that it's not exactly psychology, in the sense of being like a positive science, but it's a treatment rather of the self in society. So it as I understand it, it treats mental illness or depression or things like that in the context of what sort of social context they're living in, and this crisis of the self lives or is situated in a world in which I suppose the subject feels that he or she doesn't belong in it, and so this is something I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but as far I get the impression that psychology doesn't approach its subject matter in that way, and I think that's what psychoanalysis sort of aims to do, I suppose.
I don't know what the goals of psychoanalysis necessarily are. I just know a little bit about Lacan.
Oh, okay, I just say that because what going back to your earlier book club, Beautiful Fighting Girl, it blows my mind that Tamaki Saito is a clinical psychiatrist who finds some clinical value in Lacan, and that kind of blows my mind. I always thought Lacan was just sort of relegated purely to the humanities, but I guess not to Saito.
Have you looked up the works of Patricia Garavici?
No, I haven't heard that name before now.
She's a clinical Lacanian.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
And there's a very robust field of study in transgender psychology that heavily draws upon Lacanian psychoanalysis. And the reason why is because people who have transgender challenges, it's very difficult to try and understand them as subjects because their language, air quotes, I'm doing air quotes, is so unfixed, because, are they masculine? Are they feminine? What do they identify as? What values of those markers do they identify as? Makes sort of like, how is it linked all together? And so that's where Garavici sort of comes in. And psychoanalysis still happens as a practice. I mean, like, it doesn't have the weight that, like more developed sciences like neuroscience have now, but psychoanalysis still happens as a practice in therapy.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I believe much of it has moved away from Freud.
Yeah. I like psychoanalysis
sometimes like strongly against it because obviously a lot of people really don't like his processes and stuff.
Yeah. With that said, moving on from psychoanalysis, 2 chapters of psychoanalysis. Were there any particular things that you guys wanted to talk about in terms of Kristeva, or any of the feminine scholars?
Oh,
the feminist scholars.
Butler was.
Yeah, I mean.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's fine.
Butler's. I guess so. Moving on from Irigaray, Butler was interesting. Something I'm struggling to wrap my head around is, where is that? Page 72, deconstructing the sex-gender distinction.
Butler, 72. Okay.
This was interesting because so the Mansfield brings up Simone de Beauvoir, who I suppose was I don't know if she was the first one, but she's the most notable theorist who sort of introduces the sex-gender distinction into the lexicon of cultural theory, in that sex is a biological marker with reference to sex organs, and gender is the cultural expectations and of the kind of behaviors we expect of them in having a particular sex organ, one or the other. But Butler makes this interesting remark that, well, epistemologically, in practice, culture and therefore gender comes first, because we always already interpret nature in terms of the cultural logic that we are ingrained with. And so since we are born into a cisgendered culture, we are necessarily going to go out in nature and look for all the places where nature reproduces this binary. That I found to be particularly interesting, but at the same time, I struggle to understand how that would undermine the original formulation of the sex-gender distinction by Beauvoir, because it isn't exactly... to me, it seems like a fairly trivial observation that certain bodies have one part instead of the other. I fail to see how culture seems to be this ideology that distorts our understanding of how nature works. Like, you can just go to any infirmary and just look at babies and be like, oh, that one has a dick, that one's got a,
Well, I think, can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
There was this, I think in previous chapter about power and how these power distributions and power clashes that kind of form our subjectivity, our subject, when the book was talking about Foucault and Nietzsche. And I thought that science, I think it was mentioned that science is just one part of an arm, a paw of power that is used to, how do you say this, kind of substantiate or, substantiate, I guess, these claims why this gender, masculine, feminine, and other types of these gender distributions in a particular time in history are necessary. And therefore, whatever, let's say that there's a new gender born, and you go to a doctor and you say, and he says, well, this is wrong, this is a sickness. I thought this was kind of important. I think in this lens, I think I had some presumptions about, I always thought in terms of, well, if the doctors say this, then I guess they know this shit because, well, they're scientists kind of, or they know the nature, and therefore why would we exactly question them? But now that we know that our culture and our cultural, our subject comes from this this symbolic, this system that is already indoctrinated by these, placed within the language by these power forces. I guess it makes kind of sense to question even the scientific.
I guess I understand how that would make sense with respect to sexuality and psychiatry, because as you said, as Foucault calls it, power knowledge, is it's part and parcel of the project of social administrators and police to order society to be in a particular way. And since they can't monitor every single individual, how power manifests itself today is rather that individuals police, conduct, and differentiate themselves according to these established standards which are enforced by these dominant discourses manufactured and maintained by domineering social institutions. And so, these institutions with respect to psychiatry can define like, oh, this is a normal psyche and that's an abnormal psyche. And so you're constantly comparing and contrasting individuals to this particular model, this manufactured quote unquote truth of what it means to be a quote unquote normal human being. And especially sexuality, where we have, this dominant discourse of heteronormativity, and then everything that is not heteronormative is considered, as other, or as the fact that we even call it non-normative is a manifestation of this discourse. Where I fail to see how that's relevant is with the observation of physical distinctions between bodies, because in the physical perception of just naked bodies, it doesn't strike me as a discursive construction to discern physical differences between bodies. And that's where I fail to understand Butler's deconstruction of the sex gender distinction. If you follow.
Yeah.
I think so I haven't finished reading Bodies That Matter. I've read a fair bit of it for the Boku Girl video. But one of the things that Butler does mention, however, in Bodies That Matter, one of the things she does mention that there is a facticity to a physical form. So she does say that there is something that we would connect to the biological marker that is still worth considering. But her main focus is primarily on these performatives of gender.
And I'm on board with that. That gender is a performance. She brings up the very good example of drag.
Yes.
What makes drag so amusing to heterosexuals is that, well, to heterosexuals that would make fun of this kind of thing, but what makes drag, what's supposed to make drag so amusing is that you have this pre-understanding that the sexual organs behind the clothing and behind the surface appearance of the body are at odds with the cultural expectations we have of people with that part, right? So the fact that a man is sort of wearing a dress and acting as we would expect a female to act, that sort of demonstrates that we have this implicit understanding that, if you have one sex organ or the other, we expect you to act and behave in certain ways. And so I'm totally on board with that concept of gender being a performance. It's just, I don't have any issues with that. I'm in full agreement. It's the only thing that was puzzling to me was her deconstruction of the sex gender distinction, in which I still kind of side with Beauvoir that we can discern sex from gender, but I could be missing something.
I think the major gap here is that I don't know Beauvoir.
Okay.
I know who Beauvoir is, but I just don't know her work that well to really say this is the difference. I think. Are you familiar with the comic strip that Butler uses? I think she uses it quite a bit.
Is it mentioned in this book?
I don't remember if it is. I don't know if it was mentioned
I don't
here,
believe
but
so,
I do know it's mentioned for sure in Bodies That Matter. But it's this comic strip of where the doctor delivers a baby, and then the doctor hands it to the mother and says, "Congratulations, it's a lesbian." Anybody?
I don't know.
I think Butler was trying to sort of point to the absurdity of the claim of congratulation, it's a boy or girl, by marking it distinctly from these biological markers. And so that's a sort of situation where they may be sort of subsumed, because how do we know, if it is social, then how do we know that something is gendered as thus until it actually happens. Well, we know it partly because of these markers. And I don't really know where I was going with this. I just really love that comic strip.
I guess something I am fond of in this post-structural approach to gender and sexuality is that, as far as I understand it, Foucauldians sort of place emphasis on how language gives a name to previously unnamed human tendencies or desires or things like that. Like for instance, the terms for different sexualities. Like the word homosexual brings the concept into being. Same with heterosexual, asexual, and so forth. Whereas if these terms did not exist, they would cease to be. They would cease to be these individual markers that determine the purported interior nature of individuals. Like individuals would no longer be demarcated by their sexualities; they would just be. So I do get that much. It's just physicality doesn't strike me as such a discursive construction, and I guess that's where I'm kind of lost, I suppose.
Yeah, I would have to sort of read up on the Beauvoir. If anybody is in the text chat is familiar with this intersection, that would be very useful. Because I think this is sort of we don't have someone familiar with both. I think that's the trouble. Okay, so let's put that aside. Let's move on to. So I know Monte Cristo has had a good fare of comments. Blake or Miha, do you have any particular chapters you're interested in looking at?
Oh yeah, also feminists. I mean, the problem is I haven't really read them. My only exposure was this book.
Okay.
But I still found them interesting, particularly the bit about objectivity. That was really good. Despite my distaste towards Freud and a little bit of Lacan, I thought this appropriated them really well, because holds the objectivity sort of in art as a signifier to the real world signified. And that makes it into a almost purely literary critique, which sits very well with me. It feels definitely more in the realm of humanities, and I would love to actually see more of this kind of analysis on literature.
You're talking about the abject, right?
Yeah, the objectivity.
Like ABJECT or OBJECT?
Yeah, objectivity.
Okay, so Kristeva?
Yeah, Kristeva. Yeah, I forgot her name. Yeah, she calls it a signifier in art to the signified of the real world. I don't know if she says it exactly like that, but it makes it a literary critique and humanities, which is, I think, very interesting. Obviously, I don't really agree with the way she treats motherhood, but the rest seems sensible, I think. Surprisingly sensible.
Yeah, I think the main thing to take away from Kristeva and the abject is is to think that we're not as self-contained as of a subject as we think we are. We're constantly being pressured and pushed around by specific things, and it constantly sort of us in a way. And in some ways, we define ourselves not simply by what we think we are, but by what we reject. and I think that's a really useful thing to mention from Kristeva's abjection, which is that like the thing that you are that you are not is still you, because it makes a statement on what you think you should be.
Yeah, and she mentions that we're attracted to objectivity in fictional representations, and that like excites us, which I think seems accurate. I remember you mentioned before the somewhere else that there's an Evangelion analysis on take on this, and it makes complete sense, including even the motherhood, right? Like I think it might be accurate. At least her claims about art and objectivity are accurate. Of course, it's not rigorous. I would like to see more study on this, but it makes sense to me.
Well, I think that's sort of like the interesting thing about like, because there's a whole field of art devoted to the idea of the abject. I mean, like Piss Christ is the most famous piece of abject art, because I believe it's a copper cross of the crucifixion, just submerged in a bucket of urine, and people essentially say, well, how the hell is this art? Why is this art? Well, it's art because all of these people reject it, because they already have sort of solidified a definition of what they think is art. To create a piece by rejection is about the abject. And yeah, there is a fantastic, well, I don't know about fantastic. I read it a while ago, and I remember saying, this is a thing. But I remember there is an essay. You can find it on Ava Geeks, actually. There's a translated essay by Kotani Mari that looks at Evangelion from the perspective of abjection, and it's very interesting. I think it's actually really useful to talk about Evangelion through abjection. I mean, spoilers to everybody. Spoilers to everybody in the chat. But I mean, like the very last sequence in End of Evangelion is essentially Shinji rejecting his mother. He's rejecting the penetration of the thing to self-define himself. And then that is followed up. There's a sort of there's a sort of a pairing of this event by choking Asuka. There's a self-definition by rejection. And so it's a very abject piece of work.
Yeah. Also, I feel something I also like about this is that objectivity sort of brings together what's different and daring and radical in art with like a sort of biological response to things that we dislike in real life.
Yes.
So like you can have a poem that elicits that objectivity in people that doesn't even have to be very visceral or explicit. It can just be different from the norm, and it reminds us of real objectivity.
Yeah,
and objectivity in the real world.
Yeah, and I think it's actually really fascinating you mentioned that, because like the subject that Kristeva talks about is, well, the thing that she focuses on in her work Powers of Horror, and that Mansfield focuses on here, is the corpse, because the corpse is sort of this ultimate symbol of like how we can be and how we will eventually be, but it still resembles us. The corpse is more terrifying than, say, possibly a skull, because a skull is so far different from us that we can no longer necessarily identify with it as a person that we can become. Arguably, differs from everybody. But I think it's actually fascinating you talk about that, because when we look at, like, say, the works of horror mangakas, particularly Junji Ito, or to a lesser extent Kazuo Umezu or Hino Hideshi, a lot of their works are essentially about bodies that have been reanimated or penetrated. And that sort of penetration is very abject in this context. I mean, you look at spoilers again, everybody. Spoilers again. You look at, like, say, the story of Uzumaki. The entire story is about them trying to fight. It's about them trying to fight being subsumed into this force that constitutes everybody in the town. And so they're trying to understand themselves by rejecting all of these things. But this rejection that they're sort of enacting, this thing that they're trying to push away, is them. Because it's the townspeople, it's the force. That's really how it ends up being. And so, like, I think when we're talking about Kristeva and we're talking about horror manga, its abjection is an incredibly vital tool for understanding a lot of these sentiments that are coming up.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, like another the Junji Ito, like well, I mean that's kind of a theme with him, but the what's I forgot the name, where they are attracted to a cave in the mountain.
Yes,
I don't know if you read that.
The fault. It's like the something
There's
Ami
yeah.
Gahara fault.
Yes. Fault, I think, or something. Yeah, that has the same feel to it, because it's people attracted to their own demise, like in a weird way.
Yeah.
I suppose they don't know exactly what's going to happen to them, but it's kind of the same idea of playing with and being close to that objectivity.
Yeah, and I think that's very useful. Anybody else have any sort of lingering thoughts before we move on?
No, that was a pretty good overview of Kristeva, I thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Is anybody interested in, say, masculinity or post-colonialism?
No, I didn't like that part in the book, actually. I felt he went for some weak arguments. I mean, it's hard to go for strong arguments there.
Masculinity or post-colonialism?
Yeah, masculinity.
Oh, yeah, that one. Yeah, I don't know how I felt about that one.
Yeah, me neither.
Do you have thoughts, Joe?
So the masculinity one. So I know that when Mansfield wrote this book, he reached out to a lot of specialists.
Yeah, because he wrote a book on it, right? On like masochism or something.
Yeah. I don't know. The masculinity one was not what I was expecting, because he does make a very whose mouse is that? He does make a very good claim that I thought was very useful, which is that, like, masculine power has changed. It's essentially trying to still, in some ways, exert masculine power, but at the same time trying to pretend like it can't. And it's sort
like
of
this disavowal to practice it.
Yes, and I think that's a very important claim that he makes. But then it sort of moves on from there, and I was hoping perhaps it would have focused on that a little bit more, but it really didn't, which sort of disappointed me.
Yeah, it was just that one perspective alone.
Yeah.
Oh well.
Which was I mean, like, it does talk a little bit about it. I mean, in Sedgwick's Homosocial, it does talk about it a little bit. But
it is a big topic, so I can understand why Mansfield would just kind of take that limited view.
And I think there was one particular thing which was really useful, which is on page 101, when on the Sedgwick section, Mansfield does make the useful note of the hero, which is the male hero is good and evil, soothingly peace-loving, and mindlessly violent. He destroys things in order to save them. He loves and even wants to support his female partner, but the only equal he respects is his villainous male double. Did anybody have any 20th Century Boys vibes from this?
20th Century Boys vibes?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's the manga by 20th Century Boys, by the manga by Naoki Urasawa.
I have not read enough manga.
Oh, okay. because this is particularly the trouble that Urasawa, I think, was trying to tackle here. The idea that how do you, because if the logic here is that to fight against a violent structure, to fight against a structure that does not agree with you, and you sort of draw your moral ground, partly because you are not that violent structure, well, what role then does your enactment of violence against it mean?
What manga
And
was
I
this?
think that's 20th Century Boys.
Okay.
And I think that's absolutely important when we're talking about, like, say, the Rikyo cults that release sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system. I mean, parts of their messages were driven by these apocalyptic views because they were saying, well, this society is killing us, so we should go out and kill it. And so there's this sort of weird I would say, if we're going to borrow Sedgwick's points, there's this sort of weird masculine perversion that happens in this sort of power exertion of all of this use of violence to fight violence. And at the same time, it's trying to say, well, this violence is not a wrong one because normally we're not violent. And I thought that was really interesting. I didn't really have anything else to continue from that, but I thought it was really interesting.
No, yeah, that is a interesting point.
Okay, so let's move on to. Okay, so I am not equipped at all to deal with post-colonialism.
Oh,
like,
yeah, neither am I. This one was, this chapter went kind of all over the place. There was like one very short chapter on Spivak, and I felt like it didn't explain Spivak at all. It was like, oh yeah, Spivak was like, and then that was it.
Yeah, that section just felt like Mansfield was just saying, I know who Spivak is. Moving on. Yeah, so, I mean, I think, do any of you want to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism?
No, it's a bit. I wish it was longer, I suppose, so we could have a good grasp on it.
Because
one part I did find interesting. Well, okay. First of all, sort of this comment, I suppose, on the theories of ethnicity and race is these discussions that are sort of exploding now, and on the news and with respect to like academia and stuff. It's interesting to hear these as like a Filipino American male, because I have not felt systematically oppressed in any way, and so I take a couple ethnic studies courses, and I read lots of this race theory, and I can't identify with it in any way. And what was interesting from that perspective was, let me turn to, where is it? Need to find where this is. Is it hybridity?
Is it hybridity?
Is it? Hold up. Oh no, it's page 130, race and power knowledge. What's interesting about this was, so coming again from the perspective that I just mentioned, she does not deny in the slightest that both conservative and radical race activists, anti-racist activists, they both make this claim for Foucauldian power knowledge in their struggle to sort of define what it means to be a particular, what it's like to be a particular race or ethnicity in a particular social formation. And she argues that in all of these cases, whether left or right, what you're essentially doing is you're sort of how should I word this? This is a sensitive topic, so I even feel like uncomfortable talking about this.
It's very hard to talk about.
Something. What's her name? Amina Mama. Amina Mama. I don't even know. Maybe I'm getting this wrong, but what I understood from this short section was she uses Foucault to talk about how no matter what your politics, in all instances, what you're doing is you're trying to establish these discursive boundaries on what it means to be a particular race or ethnicity. And once you do this, you're effectively excluding, you're discursively excluding an innumerable other valid experiences that individuals classed under these groupings experience, right? So like, what's this? There's this one line I liked from her. Page 132, she says, and I believe she's saying this of both conservative and radical anti-racist activists. She writes that, quote, "This reduction of the variety of Black experience to a single model is partly the inevitable result of one group being treated as an object of analysis. But it is also inevitable if you assume that all-inclusive statements about subjectivity are possible, that there is a single Black, white, Asian, Russian, Parisian, Serbian, or British subject about whom definitive statements can be made." Let's see, where else? And then going ahead in the same paragraph, "In the case of racial politics, which are a uniquely potent site of ruthless official policy on the one hand and endless struggle on the other, we can see why power and knowledge remain locked together. Before it can act, even before it needs to know whether the Black subject is damaged, has a negative self-concept or whatever, power must make us believe that there is a single quantifiable object on which to act." So in any case, you have these groups sort of speaking on behalf of what it's like to be you, and precisely because you don't, precisely because you cannot at any given moment, like you're not on the Congress floor, or you're not in positions of power to speak on behalf of yourself. You inevitably have these groups sort of claiming to know what it's like to be you, even though these representations may not actually be what your immediate lived experience is like. But these discursive representations are inevitable in these claims to power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's let
me respond to Foxman 4900 real quick. No, totally, and I'm half Filipino, and I definitely experienced some degree of racism in my life. Friends of other races encounter more, though. Totally, and I just, in my own immediate lived experience, I don't have any of that. So that's why I feel uncomfortable kind of talking about this, because I have no idea what that's like, and that sort of goes back to what Mama was saying about these discursive representations. We need to sort of be careful about how we talk about this, because again, these generalizations don't adequately portray what it's like to live like a real sensuous existence.
Yeah, but at the same time, this is at its core, it's just a power play. So whatever model of some ethnic group or whatever they put out, you always, just by mere association, you're going to subscribe to it. So maybe I'm not sure what the purpose of generalization is, but you're probably not going to feel left out in any case when it comes to what power grants at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's sort of it feels like there's sort of a power trap here, which is that, like, if you want to enact sort of if you want to enact some sort of change or effect, then you have to sort of define a unit or an object in which power can thus exert itself. And the problem with that is that all of a sudden paints one group with this uniform brush that might not be entirely applicable. And as such, the need, it's sort of a, God damn that noise. It's sort of a catch-22 because you want to enact change, but change only happens in a way that sort of condenses particularities into one system. And the result of that is that by condensing all of that together, it's, sorry, I lost my train of thought because of that fan. That fan really threw me off. I'm just going to say cool. Yeah, that was cool. Yeah, I'm not equipped for post-colonial studies at all.
I hate how hard it is to talk about this kind of thing.
It's very challenging. I think it's very challenging. It's very difficult because it's like this. It's like,
it's a conversation like everyone's too afraid to have, but it like needs to be had, which is the difficulty.
It's also like deceptively dense because you look at the work of, like, say, someone like, I read some of Fanon's like stuff. I read a little bit of like Fanon's stuff, and he's got like an entire chapter where he talks about the see, I'm falling into this power trap right now because I want to say the N-word, but I can't say it because it's so uneasy for me to say it.
Even if you're not like speaking on behalf of yourself, or like you're playing a character, it's you don't know if that's even okay.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, like, I know I can say it, but I would feel so uncomfortable saying it. And so, like, there's this sort of this pull here. But essentially, Fanon has entire chapters where he talks about that specific word and how it sort of plays as a marker. And it's just like, well, this is really, really jarring. But it is also very essential. And so it's very challenging to talk about some of these things because they can be very dense in some ways. Well, let's move on to a more comfortable subject. Let's talk about the rhizome. Let's talk about trees. If anybody has been talking to me online through Discord or anything, they know that I have had this sort of Deleuze binge. If you check out my Twitter, you know that I've been on this sort of Deleuze binge. I'm currently trying to get through the logic of sense. It's not easy, but I think if anybody has read The Anime Machine is very Deleuzian. It's very Deleuzian. Like, have you guys read that book?
No, I missed that one.
Okay.
I haven't read Lamar, but I've tried reading Deleuze, and that dude is like, it's like reading Jack Kerouac try to write philosophy.
Deleuze is sort of like, I don't know, that guy is like super smart. Like, he's like, he's not even an autodidact because he has been firmly in the academy, but like the way he approaches topics is very reminiscent of an autodidact. He's the kind of guy who's just like, oh, today I'm interested in mathematics, so he's just going to dive right into math. And like, oh, this other day I'm interested in philosophy, I'm just going to dive right into philosophy. And it's just so many different things that he talks about.
Yeah,
but
I've been. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, please continue.
No, I've been interested in him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you're going to do analysis of animation, if you're going to do anime analysis from the perspective of the form of animation, Deleuze is crucial to understanding a lot of sort of higher level material, because animation is a machine. Animation is a Deleuzian machine, because it's a series of layers and effects and all of these particular things, these objects that by themselves are not animation, but it composites itself into a way in which it becomes a sensory thing. It becomes a thing that through this machinery of form, that it reconstitutes itself into this sort of this sort of quasi-living object. And it's not even just the layers. You know, Thomas Lamar talks about this machinery in animatism. He talks about it through animatism, how motion is negotiated through layers. It's not even just that. It includes that, absolutely. But it's also in design. It's also in sound. It's also in all of these things. And that's why Deleuze moves on a lot of his work to cinema. You know, that's why he has that whole thing about cinema, that what he talks about, you know, like image time and all these sorts of ideas. And I think that's absolutely important. This thing that I think completely challenges psychoanalysis, that we're not necessarily like these well-defined subjects, but rather we're these like, it's a sort of constant moving collection of points that in some ways makes a thing that we can think of as separate. Has anybody seen Parks and Recreation?
No, I have not.
Like the
Couple of
first
episodes.
4 seasons, I think.
Okay. Okay, you know those pictures of you know those pictures of, you know those like giant pointillism pictures where just like, you know, it's like a portrait of somebody, but then you look closely and then like every pixel is actually like a little picture of somebody else.
Oh, right.
That is, I
Yeah.
think, a very useful example of the Deleuzian machine.
Oh, okay.
When I was in Tokyo, I saw this
right.
this kind of image of the One Piece straw hats. It was super cool.
Oh, nice.
And the individual pictures were basically scenes from the entire anime. It was super fascinating.
Nice. I'm trying to
I
picture
want to
it.
ask actually.
Yeah, I tried finding that, but I
how-
couldn't. I wanted to buy it. Actually, it was a puzzle, but it was out of sale. I mean, out of print.
Yeah, how do you feel Deleuze was represented here? Having read more of him, I don't know if it was a good representation because I haven't read anything.
Well, it's not a so the thing about Deleuze is that like he talks about so many different subjects. Like he talks about cinema, he talks about psychoanalysis, he talks about philosophy, he talks about mathematics, he talks about science, he talks about sociology. Like there's so many different things that Deleuze has done, and there's so many different phases in his life that he's done them. Like there's this part on philosophy, and then there's this part where he meets up with Guattari, and then they work on the machine, and so on and so forth. I do think, from what I've read of Deleuze, the rhizome is probably the most useful when we're talking about subjectivity. And so I think Mansfield focuses on the most relevant Deleuzian idea.
Okay.
This is not all of Deleuze, but it's probably the most relevant.
Yeah, I just wondered if it was like accurate at least, because I found it really interesting. Like it was definitely the most interesting thing in here, I feel. Also, maybe probably because I was biased to agree, I guess, on his criticisms of psychoanalysis.
Yeah,
But I thought it was very good, and the analogy with the tree, it's excellent. It really works well because it does constrain you, right? Like it was what Monte Cristo was talking about at the beginning, about how one thing leads you to another, and if you don't buy into the beginning, it constrains you into discussions that you don't want to have at all in the first place.
Dude, you make me sound like an asshole.
No,
I'm kidding,
no,
I'm kidding.
I
I'm
agree
kidding.
with you. No, it's fine. I agree with you, but
I am an
yeah,
asshole.
it constrains you into certain discussions, right? And they're against that, right? It's the trunk, and you should probably look at something else.
Yeah, and I think Deleuze. I think the Deleuze and the rhizome model of analysis is probably the most important thing that we have to remember when we're talking about analysis in general, particularly anime analysis, because the entire point of the rhizome is essentially to decentralize how knowledge really should be functioning in terms of its lineage, because so he's criticizing the arborescent model, which is sort of like there's this tree and thus this hierarchy of knowledge that must be privileged. And the rhizome model is essentially saying, well, no, it's more like a network, more like a flat network. Because a rhizome, is a potato plant a rhizome root? I don't know if a potato plant is.
They said grass was.
Grass. Okay, grass. Okay, yeah. So the whole for anybody in the chat who doesn't know what a rhizome is, a rhizome. So when we look at a tree, so a tree has, a tree is a singular thing with roots, and this root sort of, these roots sort of have an origin point. They all converge. They all converge at the trunk of the tree, and so every single point that comes in from every single end of each root can sort of be, they can pull back to the trunk. The trunk is this hearth of the tree, and when you go up the tree, you can see the branches, and the branches all come from the I don't know what the pillar part of the tree is called. I don't know. But everything sort of, it grows from singular points. And when we look at a family tree, I think Mansfield uses that example as well. A family tree is, that's an arborescent model. We can pinpoint specific people where it's coming from. And so, they have sons and grandsons or daughters, granddaughters, what have you, and so on and so forth. And I think when we're talking about that, the rhizome is, on the other hand, a system that has no real central point, because it's a horizontal network. So these roots don't come from one spot. They just kind of not branch, problem with language. They spread out, and then they create more nodes. And so it's all these little nodes everywhere, and it's all spread out everywhere, and it's all connecting, but there's no hierarchy.
No sense of direction.
Yes, no sense of direction. And so when we borrow the family tree model, a use would be like, say, the in-laws. Where are the in-laws in the family tree? Or the, like cousins, and so on and so forth. Like, where do they exist along the system? And I think that's incredibly important when we're talking about analysis, because, if somebody says like, if you're going to be looking at cinema, you need to talk about its cinema. You need to talk about its visual language. Well, the rhizomatic model says, well, no, you don't. You don't have to at all, because, that makes a statement on the hierarchy of knowledge. And the purpose of the rhizomatic model of analysis is to essentially say, well, there are all of these little points, and somebody can value a particular point in the rhizome system. But that doesn't necessarily mean that means it's the origin of everything. It simply means that it is one particular section. And it's really interesting because Thomas Lamar, in the book The Anime Machine, he talks about that very specific conceit, because he says that a lot of anime analysis is socio-historical in nature, and there's very few about animation. And so I am not talking about animation simply to privilege animation, but primarily because there is a lack of it. And so he's making that conceit, and I think that's actually really, really important. Perhaps I'm just using this to legitimize my own practices, because I'm a channel that talks very little about animation. I don't know. But I absolutely love the rhizomatic model.
Yeah, me
what
too.
are
Like,
the,
I feel it aligns very well with my views and my approach to things, but it still pushes you in a certain direction, right? Like when they talk, like the mistake you just made about talking about branches, like the idea of thinking in terms of trees is, let's say, rooted completely in our way of thinking. So it's very hard to try and really completely change your paradigm of thought and approaching things
Yeah.
with a complete
Um,
rhizomatic model.
Maybe
That,
I
that,
have
that it's
one.
very hard. It makes it all the more important to actually go and do that.
Yeah, I have one technical question, I guess. So this rhizome model, I didn't read the chapter, but is it like so you have this field of thoughts and it's like a map, and but each point is actually sort of like a tree, or can it be thought of as a tree?
Not necessarily. Well, okay, so maybe I'm maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, because the chapter actually criticizes the tree model.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
But
okay,
I think they
let's.
mentioned that though. Like maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think they say because you don't want to have this rigorous way of thinking, you can include the tree model into the rhizomatic model. Uh, that's kind of like a weird way of going
Yeah.
about it, but they do mention, I think, that you can do that because the rhizomatic model is about not having a rigorous way of going about it. So completely rejecting the tree would be kind of counterproductive to what they want to
Yeah.
do.
Okay.
Like how can I think of it? Let me see if I can pull up a picture of a potato root. I sworn that was what like it looked like. Maybe I'm just like some other. Nope, that's not. Nope, that's not the. Let me see here. Let me get this picture here. Oh, okay. This is actually pretty useful. Yeah. Okay. Oh, it's literally called a rhizome. Okay. Let's copy that. Or I need to bring this out here. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. As I share. There we go. So yeah, so this is the rhizome. Well, this is a rhizome model. So like as we can see here, there's no point of origin. Like all of these things have their own roots and they all kind of spread out. And then like from each different node, sort of like ideas spread out from each different node, and then they sort of sprout out in different ways. And so like when we're talking about like what is the most important thing, well, the answer is there isn't really one, because they all sort of interact with each other in specific ways.
how would a rhizome I don't know if Lamar mentions this in the Anime Machine, but like how would a rhizomatic treatment of analysis treat like animation? Because I watched your videos and you mostly approach it from like, oh, what themes are, what themes are discussed in this particular work, or something like that. I haven't read a lot on like film theory, so I don't really know what there is to say about particular camera shots or takes, or in the context of animation. I never really know how exactly to comment on those kind of shots. So like how would a rhizomatic approach treat animation or just general movement?
Okay, so Lamar's okay, so the Anime Machine, which is a book that I will constantly recommend. The Anime Machine is itself a rhizomatic exercise of animation theory. Because he goes through a very brief history of the animation stand, and then he talks a little bit about its history, and then he talks about ballistic movement. Okay, so the most important thing, though, is where he separates his book into two major sections. The first one here is he's essentially saying, we got Miyazaki. Miyazaki does not like ballistic movement. He likes animatism. We also, on the other hand, have Anno, and Anno Hideaki does not really care so much about these distinctions. Anno, on the other hand, likes to use animatism, but also likes to reconstruct animatism in a particular way. And so Lamar's first half of his book essentially says there's this lineage. There's this one lineage of thought here that sort of talks about how animation functions, about what's important about animation, how to think about it. And then the second half of his book, he goes in a completely different direction. He talks about a completely different node of thought, which is about Chobits. And in Chobits, he says, well, Chobits is about hystericization. And so Lamar is essentially, for Chobits, he says, well, you look at Video Girl Eye, you look at Chobits, you look at like some of these Mahou Shoujo, like Magical Girlfriend sort of shows. You look at it, but there's a sort of psychoanalytical perspective here. Because one of the things that Lamar mentions about Chobits, which I think is it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Like, my God, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's just like, mwah, it's brilliant. He's saying that the metric for analyzing animation is a little bit different for Chobits, because what is Chobits about? It's about a guy. It's about people who give life, who give a particular sort of life to objects, because people in the world don't see, because Chobits is about these computers that are essentially girls, and the characters that the story revolves around are these people who give value to these objects more so than they're meant to be in the world. And so he says they're hystericized. And so what does that mean? Well, what are we watching? We're watching animation. Animation is itself a hystericized form, because it has to have the person has to hystericize the layers to create that sense of motion and movement and meaning. And so Chobits itself is to Lamar, Chobits itself is an example of incredibly innovative animation, because it's about that very hystericization that happens in anime. And so that's sort of like the big sort of rhizomatic claim that he makes in that second half, which completely is they're all connected. They're all connected through the network of what is animation and what does animation mean. But they have very different lineages. Because for Miyazaki, for Anno, animation is a very particular way. But when we get into something like Chobits, animation is this other way. And so there's these other different ways of thinking about it. And they all exist within the singular tome that sort of looks at how they may differ. And Thomas Lamar, he calls them lineages. They're different lineages, and that's absolutely fascinating. It's crazy cool. That's why it's a great book.
Well then,
Yeah, that sounds really good. It's just like going away from like I don't know, people. I don't know if especially in anime, but it happens a lot. Have certain ways they think anime should be done, and when it's not done that way, people just don't like it. And it happens even with creators, right? Like Miyazaki is infamous for his wanting to have it his way and no other way. So it's I think it would be good if more people thought this way.
Yeah, and in case I'm not being like clear again, Monte Cristo, have you seen my Understanding Disaster series?
yeah, I have.
My fourth video is a rhizomatic exercise.
Which one is that on?
It was about YKK.
Oh, okay. I picked up like the Heidegger and stuff. I didn't know Deleuze then, so I was only like focusing on the Heidegger.
Yeah. So like my first three videos are sort of well, my second video and my third video is somewhat pointed in time. because there's a sort of a lineage that happens, but like my fourth video specifically, I go in a completely different point because, you know, Evangelion and YKK essentially were published within the same time period. And so instead of moving sort of down the route, I moved horizontally, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay.
That's a sort of an example of a rhizomatic exercise, I would say. You know, when you move horizontally rather than vertically. And that's why the anime machine is brilliant. And is brilliant. Sorry, did you guys have anything else to add?
No, I think I told you some time ago. I went to see a speaker on Deleuze, and
Yes.
this conversation reminds me of something the dude said. Sort of Deleuze's conception on what philosophy is supposed to do, and something that the speaker said that if you take a look at like lots of course syllabi in the philosophy department, you'll see, you know, philosophy of mind, of literature, of art, of film, and so on. And it gives you this impression that in the, you know, in our world today, it seems that philosophy has simply been relegated to reflecting on already established disciplines. And for Deleuze, he says, no, that's not what philosophy is. Like, it was interesting. The speaker told us that there's this one interview where Deleuze is like speaking to a bunch of film students, and outright he says, you don't need philosophy to reflect on film. You do that all the time. And he says, rather, philosophy is the invention of concepts. It's the invention of ways of conceiving the world. It's the moment you, and this conversation of the rhizome is interesting because this, according to the speaker for Deleuze, the rhizome is so important because when you constantly stick to like an aberrant model of like a singular foundation point, which carries the rest of your analysis, he says that the moment you stick to this aberrant model, you arrest thought, you arrest the creativity of the intellect, and you need to constantly be looking for more ways of conceiving these things. And so essentially, philosophy then is not it's not about finding final truth, but it's about conceiving creative ways to navigate around an ever-changing world. So I think it's interesting how you talk about this approach to analysis. You're constantly looking for more things that you can take away from it, and it's never this like fixed thing that's like set in stone.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely essential. So I do want to mention, Murderous Johnny has said, have you ever considered making a video on anime machines ideas? So Murderous Johnny, I don't know if you've watched the videos, but you should watch my videos, Miyazaki, Lineage, and Depth, and the second video, which was Hideaki, Chobits, and Superflat, because why listen to what I have to say about the anime machine when you can just listen to what Lamar has to say about it? Because Lamar, I just have Lamar come on and he talks about the anime machine very briefly. But yeah, so yeah, I think it's really useful. Sort of, do you guys want to talk about the subject in technology or postmodernism? So that would be Lyotard, Jameson, Haraway, etc.
Postmodernism makes me sad. This whole it just ended on such a sour note. Like, we have no sense of self. There's a constant anxiety, and I don't want to go through my day like that.
But isn't that something that Lacan already establishes, you know?
Well, I mean, I don't know. The chapter right before the subject in technology and like the Deleuze chapter, the whole thing was like a critique of psychoanalysis. How like desire isn't looking for something impossible, but desire is this. It's a constant drive of eternal becoming. You're constantly you're not like a fixed self. The self is treated as a project that's never arrested, and so you're constantly sort of engaging in the process of transformation. And I don't know, that's a kind of a hopeful thing. And then you hit the last chapter, and Leotard's just like, we're all fucked. That's it. There's so many things that's out there to kill us. Nuclear wars, diseases, we're dead. I don't know.
Diseases, we're dead. Yeah, it's
Adam. Oh, sorry. Oh, were you gonna say something?
Oh, I was gonna say, I don't know. I don't think it's that bad. Well, because the idea of the simplest postmodernist idea is the Leotardian one. The death of the grand narrative. We've all lost our. The great voyage is gone.
Well, what was interesting was because most. I don't know. You do a Google search on postmodernism, and that's like typically the first result that comes up, like the Leotardian definition of that. What was interesting was I don't really hear a lot about Jameson, and I think Jameson's approach is sort of interesting because it seems like he's defending the loss of this meaning that the grand narrative once provided. What is it? Hold on.
Well,
Where's
my Akira video was the Jamesonian postmodernist take.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, I directly cited him.
Oh shit! It's been a while since I've seen it.
I specifically said, as Frederick Jameson says.
I'm too stupid to understand.
So if I remember it correctly, Jameson's postmodernism is useful for two very specific concepts. First of all, it's pastiche, and the second one is schizophrenia. The general idea is that pastiche is essentially where it's just like this chaotic sort of decentralizing. It's a sort of decentralizing of everything. And I'm going to use Akira because it's a pretty good example of that. Akira essentially shows about 3 decades worth of images. It shows the Japanese sort of militant Red Army groups. It shows its post-war identity. It shows the atomic bomb. It shows a sort of a new neon Tokyo, but it all shows it in one single movie. It's all there together, 30 years worth of images there together. And so that's where the pastiche comes in. The schizophrenia part of it is essentially to say, well, if we're talking about the idea of like direction and where modern grand narratives might guide us, a schizophrenic sort of state is essentially saying, well, hold on. It doesn't necessarily do so because it might not. It could completely contradict itself. And so, going back to Akira, the idea that the idea of Tetsuo as being a sort of a spoilers, Tetsuo being this, this metamorphosis sort of character. He is representative of Japan. He is this new modern state, this new advanced state, but he's so confused as to what to do about it in some ways. That scene where he is seeing all of these like cute little characters sort of dancing by his bed, but he doesn't see them like they're amusing or whimsical, even though they're presented to us as amusing or whimsical. He sees them as terrifying, and so it's very schizophrenic. It leads one way, but it doesn't necessarily do so.
I'm wondering. Well, it seems like when we do analysis of any sort, we're looking for some kind of meaning, and to me, at least as the chapter in postmodernism seemed to present it, it's like this denial of meaning. I'm wondering what the point of the sort of postmodern sentiment is supposed to contribute to analysis, because it seems to be this like whole denial of meaning. I don't know if that was coherent or if that makes sense, but
so first off, I do want to respond to Foxman, who says that I feel like pastiche is more about eliminating the strict borderlines between things. Yeah, I think that's a better way to describe pastiche than what I used, Foxman. That's a good way to describe it. The second thing is, I wouldn't necessarily say entirely meaning, but more so the lens in which this meaning comes about. Because one of the things that Mansfield mentions is that, a modernist take would be like, if you, he uses the Soviet Union and suprematism as an example, which I think is really good. Because, if you were a scholar in the Soviet Union, everything is through the lens of the revolution. Everything is through the lens of the communist state. And so when that all gets removed, when the grand narrative of communism collapses, is no longer there, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no more meaning, but rather that the lens in which this meaning comes about becomes chaotic in a way.
Yeah, I think it's useful because like the example with the Deleuze's the tree, you can, with postmodernism, you can take concepts or ideas that are that have their ties to a trunk and just separate them from that and use them in whichever way you want. Like let's say there are a lot of problematic things with Freud's psychoanalysis, but with postmodernism, let's say you can just take whatever thing you find useful there and take it wherever you want it. Which is what happens, right? Like with the unconscious.
Yeah, man.
We don't really talk about it in the way Freud talked about it, but we still use that concept.
It all comes back to the rhizome.
Yeah, the rhizome is like a very postmodern model, I feel.
Well, I think it's considered like a post-structuralist model.
Okay.
But I mean, like those words are used so interchangeably. Even though they are different, they are used so interchangeably that we could call it that, I guess.
What's interesting, I think, is on page 165, when Mansfield elaborates Jameson's concept of the postmodern. He writes that, quote, "The aim of contemporary critique then is to start to redraw the cognitive maps that will allow the postmodern condition to be known, authentically felt, and perhaps transformed. The postmodern subject, therefore, is a doubly disoriented one. It wanders in a world it cannot accurately conceptualize, and its own interiority has lost its sense of intense feeling and meaningful place." What's interesting is, maybe I'm misunderstanding this passage, but it seems to me that Jameson wants to perhaps undermine the postmodern condition to, I don't know, reaffirm the sense of meaning that we used to have in the world when we had grand narratives, but perhaps without erecting the grand narratives again.
I think I'm not entirely sure what Jameson's intention is necessarily, because Jameson has himself noted before that he considers himself a late modernist more so than a postmodernist. So it's possible he could be, and I think the sort of the trouble with the postmodern idea is that it falls into the very problem that a lot of people are talking about with Lyotard. With Lyotard's claim of postmodernism, which is that, well, isn't postmodernism itself a grand narrative? I think that sentiment can be sort of captured in there. I think Jameson might be trying to understand what this new thing is, but there's also the conceit that it may sort of lead to the construction of, or it may lead to the revealing of a new grand narrative itself.
Yeah,
but honestly, I'm not entirely sure.
Well, yeah, but if you look at like the recent developments in like this year, I mean, who's to say that any grand narrative is dead? I mean, just look at what's happening, you know?
I feel that what's happening is a result of there being no grand narratives. Like lots of contradictory ideals in politics.
I mean, yeah, but you know, when you say postmodern, it's basically just this. You know, it's also something like sophistry, because when you say, well, like Azuma Hiroki, when he used his database modeling, he said, well, anything can fall into the database, even the meta narratives, and so you know it can just be said, and that's just going to be, you know, it's a reaffirmation of itself, the postmodern.
All right. Okay. So before we get into this, I think a big question therefore ends up being, well, let's sort of relate this all back to anime analysis, because this is an anime analysis channel, or at least an anime video channel. I don't know if I would consider myself an analysis channel. So subjectivity. When someone says they're looking at something through a subjective viewpoint, what do you guys think that means?
I think it's this. Well, okay, I don't watch enough anime YouTube videos to answer that question, but I don't know. I hear that phrase and I just think, well, you know, I'm not the final word on this, because you know it's just how I feel or how I personally receive this particular piece. Just this sort of understanding that the object is not like the object of analysis is not something of which we can say that oh, this is the defining feature of this particular object, right? It's not like you know, and when we analyze anime videos, or anime, we're not fucking chemists. We're not, you know. So I don't know.
I think people still refer to that in the Enlightenment sense, at least going by the terminology of the book, because they're not really talking about subjectivity. If they were talking about it in the sense of the psychoanalysis school of thought, then subjectivity would actually aim to find a truth there. So they wouldn't refer to it in the way they do. Because when people say I'm being subjective here, they mean this only applies to me, which would not be what psychoanalysis is trying to find. And at the same time, is not anti-subjective in the Foucaultian sense. So it's definitely still rooted on the Descartes' way of thinking about the subject, at least in the most colloquial sense. When people just say, "Oh, I'm just being subjective," they're just talking about their own experience.
Well, I'm not sure. I think people just like to explain their perspective from their position in the system, I suppose. You know, when somebody does, let's say, a feminist blog, and they position themselves into that role, so it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say that that's the Descartes, the Enlightenment perspective.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think the main takeaway I got from Mansfield, sort of when putting it together with analysis in general, is just that how we come about through information is placed through a lens, and Mansfield sort of gives us a lot of lenses to look at. And I think analysis sort of probably would benefit a little bit more if they were more upfront with whatever lens they want, aside from them as sort of this swelling individual subject. I mean, I think you made a great point there, Mihai, which is that like it's not entirely all Cartesian. I mean, there are like feminist blogs and whatnot. But man, where is that moment? Where is that moment where we're going to get, say, a post-colonial look at anime? Where's my Haruhi Suzumiya and Fanon analysis?
I feel there's some of that sometimes on the internet, not on YouTube, I suppose. But people do take specific lenses to look at anime while still claiming some sort of subjectivity. Maybe some blogs or comments online. There's people who definitely are aware of that.
Joe,
I think what we're lacking is a bigger voice.
Are you, Joe? Are you suggesting that analysts ought to be more conscious and explicitly state what sort of forces are at work that constitute them as a subject when they go about analyzing work? Like, oh, this is what is informing my my view on this kind of thing, and then going from there.
I don't know if they have to explicitly state that, but yeah, sure, I would say that. Okay.
It's just, I suppose the problem with that is, I mean, this goes back to Foucault, who openly kind of he pokes fun at the idea that individuals are juxtaposed against the sort of powers at work in their society and repressing individuals, when in fact, for Foucault, individuals are the very craftwork of power. So I mean, lots of people aren't really keen on that view. Or I mean, like, if you've never even like read these guys, you know, it's kind of hard to it's hard to approach a work in that way when you're kind of ignorant of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, but well, to be fair, these are not the only guys, right? Like these sort of ideas. I mean, that's kind of the point of the book. These ideas permeate culture, so you don't have to be aware of them to be influenced by what they've been saying. Like the point is that we are all influenced by this, so it's just a little bit of awareness.
Well, on that one, I think it'd be good to sort of move into sort of one of the big gaps in this book, which Monte Cristo brought up a long time ago, which is very important, which is that what about Derrida? Because Derrida was never in this book.
Yeah, it has gaps. Like it mentions Wittgenstein, and I think it mentions it in the wrong place, because it goes when he's gonna talk about Lacan as if they were kind of in the same space, and they're really not.
Yeah.
So it does have gaps. I feel perhaps the problem is when it says it's not gonna go into phenomenology, it's just gonna be genealogy study. It kind of biases or limits the space in which it can discuss some topics. Like it can't go into Derrida, because you cannot just say, oh, this is his influence, because Derrida was particularly unintentionally dense, and he didn't always explicitly describe what he wanted to talk about. So if you go into Derrida, you can't just go into the genealogy. You have to go into the nitty-gritty details of him.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a problem with perhaps the approach of the book.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a challenge with the book. Okay. Does anybody have any sort of like lingering comments or thoughts?
I had notes.
Okay, can I jump in with a question? Would it be so wrong if general anime analysis stayed on this Descartesian level?
I don't think there's anything particularly wrong by stating the Cartesian position. But I think the sort of position that the book has is that the Cartesian position is sort of a somewhat simplistic look on how the subject behaves. Like, like let's say for example, let's say I make a review and then someone says, well, like what is it about this review that you find valuable or something? And I say, oh, it's I'm looking at this subjectively. Well, what are you a subject to? Because to be subjective is to be subject to something. And if you're taking the Cartesian perspective, which is that I'm just subject to myself, well, the question becomes, well, what lenses about yourself necessarily make you, reducible to that state?
I understand it, but would it be so bad for people to still think that they are their own sprouting selfhood?
I don't think it's necessarily bad. My position is that I think analysis as a practice in the community might be it might be better to at least sort of play around with some of these ideas. Like if this direction maintains that it's firmly Cartesian, then I wouldn't be all like, oh, analysis in this community is shit. But I do feel like there's a sort of loss in not considering some of these ideas and a little bit more of the, I guess, probably the mainstream community. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, I don't think staying in the Cartesian space is like very useful because I said that a little bit a while before. People just kind of mean, oh, it's just my point of view, and it kind of discourages discussion in the first place because people kind of just say, oh, it's just my point of view. It's like putting information out into space without adding anything of value. Maybe that's too harsh or rude.
Well, the value here is that the more insightful guys who produce reviews, they sometimes reinvent the wheel, and that itself is for the knowledgeable or ignorant reader, it's still of value. You can still talk about it. Like,
sure.
If somebody would invent a lens in some sense and that or just constructed from his own environment and then talk about some anime about it from that perspective through that lens, I mean, it would still produce interesting discussion. I don't know. I'm just practical like that.
But sure, I mean, like, there's also a practical dimension to this. Like let's say, for instance, you have a very particular perspective of way things work, and it's, I don't know, let's say it's Heideggerian, right? Let's say you're a very Heideggerian, but you've never read anything about Heidegger. It just sort of came about. I think a useful way is still, it might still be useful to at least know Heidegger, because the counter arguments that would thus be presented against Heidegger would arguably be presented against you.
Yeah,
and so there is a practicality to it.
You are able to better articulate your points as well. Like, it's always useful to know of the better arguments that have been made for your position and against it.
And I think when we're looking at sort of thicker journals as well, it might be useful to learn like at least some of these theorists, because like For instance, if we're looking at, say, the work of David Morris, when he's talking about sort of Japan's rapping groups, he uses Lacan to situate a lot of his analysis. Understand, like, at least some of Lacan, because otherwise it just feels like a word salad.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see here. So for Foxman, when talking about these issues, what are some facets that apply only to anime work, much differently for anime as opposed to other media? I think probably just what Lamar says in the Anime Machine. I'm so influenced by that book.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. Like animation brings a whole new facet of to the medium of film, and the way anime does it is unique. So the only way you can explore that aspect if you move horizontally from film, right? Like you're never gonna land on what makes anime unique if you follow like in a prescriptive I can't pronounce that, sorry.
Prescriptivist?
Yeah, prescriptivist way, a prescriptivist view of film, right? You're not gonna be able to articulate properly what makes anime unique, or what allows it to stand out, and in ways, and what stories it can tell.
Yeah,
because
I do
again,
think... Oh yeah.
Animators in Japan do things that animators in the West don't really do, at least 2D animators, right? Like the school of thought of limited animation really changes things.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, so I think the facets, when we're talking about facets, I think the most important one is probably understanding knowledge is rhizomatic. Like that's, for me, that's probably the most useful one. But what about you guys?
Yeah, no, I'm in the same, I'm of the same mind here. That's the only way you can really take what's new and add it to what you already have without biasing your discourse in negative ways.
Mia,
what about you?
Well, as I said, I didn't finish the book, but
oh yeah,
yeah, I'm kind of I ignored. I kind of regret that, but I appreciated anime even without these new lenses. I learned to appreciate it. I still think, even after watching it for 12 years, that it's something special, and it is different, So I'm not sure. I think that there are other mechanisms that are just fine without these lenses. I don't mean to ignore them, especially now that you guys presented them to me, but in this book, of course. But the facets that only apply to anime, yeah, that is something that just anybody can come up with on their own, I think.
Oh, also, something I forgot to make a note of, the way a feminist critique works in the West is very different to how it would work in Japan. Because I remember somewhere in the book, I sadly didn't make a note of this, but like, for example, the way it talks about men winning women, like they compete for women and then they win her and she becomes an object of that. And the way Japan does romance is completely different, but it doesn't feel feminist, right? Like harems are the complete opposite of the homosocial view that this book has, but it still doesn't feel feminist. So some of these things really only apply to Western values, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the distinction works. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know how we would approach that topic, because I don't think anyone's gonna argue that the traditional harem thing in anime is feminist, yet it's clearly not homosocial in the way that this book described it.
Let's see here. Smokeman asks, in the beginning of the Enemy Machine, Lamar introduces this concept of the animation the train produces. How is CGI to be described in this analogy? I don't really know if it's the analogy of the train. Okay. So I've talked to Lamar, and his position is generally that, you know, some hardcore adherence to animation would say that, you know, if it's not 2D, then technically it isn't anime. But Lamar thinks otherwise. Lamar thinks that CGI and 3D can definitely be anime, because his focus is primarily on how layers function to create this unified movement. And when we're looking at that very, very broadly, it's more so about like how individual components might function to achieve a very specific way of presenting things. And CGI can absolutely work in that. He actually talks about that a little bit, rather, in his discussion on Superflat. Superflat does not necessarily have to negotiate 2D-ness, but rather can create a sense of a 3D. And CGI is useful in that as well, because he uses the example of Avalon. Avalon is, you know, it's this live action thing, but it captures some sort of sentiment that we might consider to be animatic, because it's a series of effects and layers just sort of splattered on top of each other to create the motion that exists there. So I guess the answer is sure, why not?
When was this written?
2009.
Okay.
Well, it was published 2009. He was working on the idea as far back as 2005, as far as I can recall, because he published an article called The Multiplanar Image in 2006, which was the bedrock foundation of his book that came later.
All right. Because I feel CGI has, in recent times, kind of been, at least in Japan, been influenced by the way they do 2D animation. So I would say CGI definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't read the Anime Machine. I don't know the points it's making, but I assume that will work towards.
I don't think he's saying like it has to be 2D. I think he's just saying the easiest way to see this in action is through 2D.
Yeah.
But yeah. So general recommendations before we end this. Would you guys recommend Nick Mansfield's Subjectivity?
Yeah. It if you're interested in 20th century philosophy or cultural theory, it's very solid. It's there's this interesting passage at the end of the chapter on Foucault called The Aesthetics of Existence, and Foucault kind of calls for kind of understanding and coming to terms with all the forces at work that constitute your sense of self, who you perceive yourself to be, and sort of understanding that you're, at least what I took away from this was that your self should not be conceived as fixed. We ought to strive to, as far as we can go, to constantly reinvent ourselves. Just kind of avoid the kind of stasis of being that perhaps the Cartesian individualistic sense of self depicts the subject to be. So it is an interesting take on, you know, whether it's you know, analysis or just general being in the world, just kind of being more aware of your surroundings and the way you relate to it. It's an interesting, you know, take on how we navigate our way in the world.
I would recommend it, but not to be read by itself, but to sort of guide you through other authors. So when like as a map, I suppose. So when you're reading Lacan, you're like, oh, this is where I'm at in this grander history or genealogy of the discussion of the subject. But by itself, I don't know how useful it could be, but surely a great guide, though. And it helps give some perspective in history, I suppose.
Yeah, as a guide, I think it's fine. I I mean, I loved it until I realized that perhaps these these are basically what the author did was just basically abstracts of their whole body of work, and so I was kind of disturbed by that realization. But yeah, I think as a guide, it's pretty good, and I think it abstracts again the more complicated language of all of these authors, especially like Lacan or some other authors that make it a bit harder to understand them.
Yeah, I think my recommendation is read this book if you are interested in these things. For somebody who might not be going into this book, it might not be that helpful. But if you are interested in seeing how some theorists might function through a lens of subjectivity, this is, I think, is a very big, important underlying through a lens of subjectivity, then this might be useful. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Do any of you guys have YouTube channels?
No.
No.
Okay.
I just have a blog, but I'm starting a YouTube channel, so I'll let you guys know.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a blog with just one entry from like a year ago.
Cool.
Yeah. I might write
All right.
more. I mean, mostly I write on Reddit or whatever.
Okay, just link it to me in the Discord chat, and I'll link it, I guess, in the video description or something. I don't know. I'll figure something out. Murderous Johnny, probably. I will probably do this more often, depending on how much time I have. But yeah, thank you very much, Monte Cristo. Thank you very much, Miha, and thank you very much, Blake, for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you guys have any last things to say before I end this broadcast?
No.
No, nothing else.
All right.
It was fun.
Take
Okay,
care.
so yeah, I hope you guys enjoy your Sunday, and peace.
Peace.